new poll suggesting that a majority of UK voters, 56%, are actually in favour of a ban on the export of weapons and spare parts for military equipment. So should the UK stop selling arms to Israel? You can email us talktoday@talkTV, you can tweet @talkTV, and you can text talk plus your message to 87222. Well, onto our top story today. Rishi Sunak is facing growing pressure, as we've said, over the arms deal between the UK and Israel. The Lib Dems, the SNP and a former national security advisor are calling for sales to be suspended immediately.
Now, speaking to Harry Cole on The Sun's Never Mind the Ballots programme last night, the Prime Minister shied away from sanctioning Israel. Here's what he had to say.
I spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu last night and was very clear with him that the situation is increasingly intolerable, and what we urgently need to see is a thorough, transparent investigation into what has happened, but also a dramatic increase in the amount of aid getting into Gaza, removing the barriers, but also closer work with aid agencies to make sure things like this don't happen again.
Well, here to discuss that possibility are Rebecca Hudson from the News Movement and James Hansen from Times Radio. Rebecca, you were watching that clip there. What did you make of Rishi Sunak's response?
I mean, what response? I just think it feels very anodyne and vanilla at a time where, we have seen the horrendous kind of, the impact of what's been happening in Gaza now for months. And, what happened with those aid workers is absolutely despicable. It likely contravenes international law if the worst is to be suspected. And, now is the time to harden up our response. And I think there is a horrendous argument that by our continued arming of Israel, we are somehow now complicit in what is happening in Gaza. And so I think, it's all very well to kind of dance around the issue and say we're going to toughen up, but we actually do need to toughen up. We've seen Joe Biden, we've seen the US abstain from the vote with the UN at the end of last week, which was their kind of signal to Israel that you are losing international support, and now it's absolutely time for the United Kingdom to match or go further than that and say we are not going to arm Israel while aid workers, and let alone the tens of thousands of Gazan casualties, mount up.
James, can you explain what that relationship actually looks like? There have been times in the past where the UK have said, OK, we're going to stop providing arms. So that mechanism does exist. How difficult is it actually to use it?
Well, it does exist. I mean, I think it's worth just saying that we don't give, in the grand scheme of things, that much aid to Israel. We're talking tens of millions of pounds, which is significant. But when you compare it to what the US give, would it actually make any difference to the situation on the ground in Gaza? Probably not. I think the key thing is symbolically, it would be a really significant moment. Up until now, Rishi Sunak has tried to be a critical friend to Israel. But the language he's been using and the increasingly tough talk we've been seeing from, for example, David Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, has really been falling on deaf ears when it comes to the Netanyahu government. So whether we need to go further, but you're right, Britain has a long history of when it objects to the policies of certain foreign governments, you can withhold military aid. And of course, there are good reasons for giving military aid to countries. Look at how we're supporting Ukraine at the moment. But equally, if you object to how that weaponry might be used, it is perfectly legitimate to scale it back.
And Becca, over 200 aid workers have already lost their lives in Gaza. What is the significance of the 3 British aid workers? And how do you view the fact that the rhetoric seems to have changed in the last 3 days since those 3 British aid workers were killed?
I think that's actually quite uncomfortable because you're right, there have been a lot of aid workers that have died, the majority of them from Gaza, Palestinian people. Obviously, the fact that now these are Australians, British, like you say, I think it brings it home, doesn't it? And I think it does, it kind of wakes us up to it, which I do think is a kind of uncomfortable kind of element to this story. But, it focuses the mind. Like, these are people who are there to simply alleviate the horrors that the people of Gaza are going through no fault of their own. 2.5 million people crammed into now Rafah, the vast majority of casualties and people suffering being women and children. These are people who are risking their lives to help others. And if we can't protect them, then surely, there has to now be the conversation, enough is enough. But I think the way that everyone's kind of woken up and now talking about this is uncomfortable. Let alone the fact that we've had tens of thousands of Gazans die, since October 7th, and we haven't had this conversation. But I think it brings it home. And if that is the mechanism that gets this conversation happening, then maybe it's, I don't know, maybe there's something, yeah.
The Prime Minister used the word sort of increasingly intolerable. The reality is, James, is that it has been tolerated up until now. And if it says increasingly intolerable, what happens for then there to be a difference or a change in stance from the UK government?
It's a very good point. More than 30,000 people have now died in Gaza, according to the Hamas-run health ministry there. And so you could easily say, you know, why is this now a breaking point? Why is this now a tipping point? Why does it take the death of Western aid volunteers to make Western leaders say enough is enough? But I mean, Israel would say, look, they are at war, and they would say that in a conflict, there will be civilian casualties and there will be tragedies like this. And the government have always accepted, as of the Labour Party, Israel's right to defend itself and to go after Hamas. The issue now is whether the aid situation is just becoming so severe that enough is enough.
And of course, the concern from the Prime Minister is that if we're giving them weapons which are then killing British civilians, you know, it gets extremely, extremely complicated.